Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to break down the arguments from Mufti Robiul Islam on what he calls transgender ideology. We're going to walk through his entire perspective, how he defines it, his critiques, and what he sees as the potential consequences for society. So Mufti Robiul Islam really frames his whole argument around this one central conflict. It's this idea of a clash between, on one hand, your own internal subjective feelings, and on the other, what he calls objective biological reality. For him, this question right here, it's the absolute heart of the entire debate. Okay, so where does he even start with all this? Well, according to Mufti Robiul Islam, it all kicks off with how you define the key term. Let's dig into how he lays the groundwork for his whole argument. The source material starts right here, with this specific definition. And what it does is it sets up the whole idea of transgender as something based on an internal mental feeling, a mental sense of gender. The key thing here, from his perspective, is that it's not based on the physical, observable traits someone has at birth. And he argues that this is a huge departure from the gender categories that have been recognized traditionally and, religiously. In his view, this isn't just about tweaking the old categories. It's about creating a totally new one, built on a completely different foundation. Now, this next part is really interesting. The source material makes a super critical distinction between two things that often get mixed up: the third gender and transgender. And according to Mufti Robiul Islam, if you don't get this difference, you're going to miss the whole point of his argument. So, here's how he breaks it down. Mufti Robiul Islam says that the third gender, or hijra, is something that's seen as a biological reality. It's tied to an inborn physical condition. But he argues transgenderism is based purely on how an individual feels inside. And for him, that's a massive, non-negotiable difference. So, to put it simply, the argument from the source is this. One of these categories, the third gender, is accepted because it's rooted in something you can see, something physical. But the other one, well, that's framed as a purely psychological idea that, in his view, actually goes against the physical evidence. And that distinction really leads us into the next big part of his argument. This is where Mufti Robiul Islam starts to explore what he sees as a total breakdown of logic and a real threat to the way society is ordered. To kind of poke holes in this idea of self-identification being the only thing that matters, Mufti Robiul Islam uses an analogy. He basically asks, hey, if this is how it works, could we or should we apply that same logic to things like jobs, things that are supposed to be defined by actual skill and training? He argues that it's just not logically consistent. You can't grant recognition in one area based only on a feeling, but then turn around and deny it in another area where you demand objective proof. To him, that's completely arbitrary. And this quote really gets to the heart of his warning. He's saying that if you take this one idea and make it a right, you could end up unraveling the entire fabric of society. A society that he believes is built on things like merit, objective facts, and rules we've had for a long, long time. Okay, so from there, the argument takes a turn. It starts to focus on what the source describes as really severe consequences, especially when it comes to the law and our personal safety. And this is where things really escalate. Mufti Robiul Islam warns that this whole ideology could create massive legal loopholes that just tear down accountability. He lays out a scenario. What if a 40-year-old criminal just says they're a 6-year-old child to get out of being punished as an adult? He also raises major concerns about men demanding to enter women-only spaces, like hostels or prisons, which he argues would put women's safety and privacy at serious risk. And to back this up, the source doesn't just stick to hypotheticals. Mufti Robiul Islam points to what he claims are real-world incidents that have already happened in countries that have these kinds of policies. He holds these up as proof of the very dangers he's talking about. So, according to Mufti Robiul Islam, if you get rid of that anchor, that biological reality he keeps talking about, then there's really no limit to what someone can claim to be. And this is where he takes his argument to what he sees as its ultimate logical end. He essentially asks, If your identity is based only on what you feel inside, then what's to stop someone from identifying not just as a different gender, but as a completely different species? Where do you draw the line? And more importantly, what reason do you have for drawing it there? And then the source points to the existence of groups like the Otherkin as proof. He says, look, this isn't a hypothetical anymore. He sees this as the inevitable end result of an ideology that has no boundaries, and he labels it a mental distortion. So after building his case, piece by piece, starting with personal identity and ending up at what he calls legal chaos, the argument finally reaches its conclusion. It's really a summary of the core position that Mufti Robiul Islam is putting forward. And this pretty much sums up his entire perspective. He's saying this isn't just about how someone identifies. For him, it's a fundamental challenge to what he sees as scientific fact, logical thinking, and the established social and even divine order. And that leaves us with this final challenging question from the source material. Mufti Robiul Islam's argument wraps up by asking us to really think about the trade-offs. Is establishing what he calls a right for one group worth the potential cost to the entire system that he's just laid out? It's a heavy question, and it's right at the center of this very complex and very current debate.